The world was told the 2003 Iraq War was about weapons of mass destruction and supposed links to terrorism. But what if a critical part of the story was hidden in plain sight, in the procedural paperwork of the United Nations from 3 years earlier? Paperwork that had nothing to do with WMDs and everything to do with oil, money, and a quiet rebellion that tested the foundation of American economic power. A story that ends not with a mushroom cloud, but with the silent reversal of a financial challenge. Okay, so to understand the official story, we have to go back to the lead-up to March 2003. The case for war, repeated constantly, was clear. Saddam Hussein's regime had weapons of mass destruction. A second justification, argued just as forcefully, was the claim of links between Iraq and terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. This was the narrative presented to the world, a story of imminent threat and a necessary defense of global security. But while the world was fixated on that storyline, something else was happening, almost entirely unnoticed by the public. An anomaly. In November 2000, Iraq, still under heavy international sanctions, made a bold move. With the procedural approval of the United Nations, it stopped selling its oil for US dollars, and instead, it would now require payment in euros. This was not a secret. It was reported in financial news at the time, but mostly dismissed as a political stunt. Yet, this decision represented a direct, symbolic challenge to an economic order that had defined global power for decades. It was a move that, while small on its own, had the potential to show a crack in the very system that underpins the US dollar's global dominance. The decision was not some backroom deal. It was a formal request processed through the United Nations Oil for Food program. Under this program, the United Nations controlled Iraq's oil sales to make sure the money was used for humanitarian goods. When Iraq requested the currency change, the United Nations Sanctions Committee found it had no legal basis to block it, so it was approved. For the first time, a major Middle Eastern oil producer, even one under sanctions, had officially shifted its oil sales away from the dollar. At the time, United Nations officials even noted the move might cost Iraq money in exchange rates, which suggests the motive was more political than economic. It was a calculated act of defiance, a declaration of monetary independence aimed squarely at Washington. This single decision transformed Iraq from just being a rogue state in the eyes of the US into something more, a symbolic risk. It was not about the value of the oil Iraq was selling, it was about the precedent it was setting. To understand why this was so significant, you have to understand the petrodollar system. We broke down exactly how the petrodollar system works in our previous video. I will leave that link below, because what happens next only makes sense if you understand the mechanism. After the United States left the gold standard in 1971, it struck a series of understandings, most critically with Saudi Arabia, to price oil in United States dollars. Think of it like this. This arrangement created a kind of global toll booth. If any country wanted to buy oil, it first had to buy United States dollars. That creates a constant, massive global demand for dollars, which props up the dollar's value and allows the United States to run huge deficits. It is the bedrock of American financial power. Now, critics of what is called the petrodollar war theory correctly point out that Iraq's oil output under sanctions was way too small to single-handedly threaten this entire system. But that misses the point. The danger wasn't Iraq's volume. It was the potential for contagion. If a sanctioned, contained nation like Iraq could switch to the euro, what was stopping other, larger OPEC nations? Iran had already floated the idea of pricing its oil in other currencies. Venezuela was exploring barter systems to get around the dollar. Saddam's move, therefore, wasn't just a political statement. It was a crack in the foundation of the petrodollar monopoly. If that crack were to spread, it could trigger a global shift away from the dollar, potentially leading to a sharp decline in its value and a crisis for the U.S. economy. The risk wasn't that Iraq would topple the dollar, but that it would show others how it could be done. As the drumbeat for war grew louder through 2002 and into 2003, the official justifications began to look increasingly shaky. UN weapons inspectors on the ground were not finding the alleged weapons of mass destruction stockpiles. Intelligence was being questioned. The supposed links between Saddam's secular government and the fundamentalist Al-Qaeda were fiercely debated. Later, the 9/11 Commission would find no evidence of a collaborative operational relationship between them. And while the public case was visibly falling apart, the inconvenient economic fact that Iraq was successfully operating its oil sales outside the US dollar remained constant. Yet, it was completely absent from the mainstream debate. The news focused on weapons inspections and political rhetoric, while the currency rebellion was ignored. The narrative was controlled, and the discussion was narrowly focused on weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, issues that would later be proven to be based on flawed or exaggerated intelligence. The invasion of Iraq began on March 20th, 2003. Within weeks, the government had fallen. And almost immediately, the economic restructuring began. The Coalition Provisional Authority, or CPA, was set up to govern the country. On May 22, 2003, just 2 months after the invasion, UN Security Council Resolution 1483 was adopted. This resolution did two critical things. First, it lifted the old sanctions. Second, it established the Development Fund for Iraq, known as the DFY. All of Iraq's future oil revenue would now be deposited into this fund. And where was this fund held? At the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. With that, Iraq's brief experiment with the petro-euro was over. The country's oil industry was brought swiftly and decisively back into the US dollar system. All oil sales would once again be conducted in US dollars, with the revenue flowing through a US bank, under the oversight of a US-led authority. Alongside this, the CPA issued orders that radically remade Iraq's economy. CPA Order 39, for instance, opened the country to 100% foreign ownership in most sectors, a kind of economic shock therapy implemented by an occupying power. Now, it is crucial to be clear. The official position of most historians and foreign policy analysts is that the war in Iraq was driven by a complex mix of factors: flawed intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, security fears after the September 11th attacks, and long-standing geopolitical goals. They argue correctly that Iraq's sanctioned oil industry was too small at the time to pose a genuine threat to dollar supremacy. This perspective cannot be ignored. And yet, the sequence of events is undeniable, and it's deeply uncomfortable. A country with some of the world's largest oil reserves challenges the US dollar and switches its oil sales to the euro. 2.5 years later, that country is invaded under a pretext that later proves to be false. And one of the very first acts of the occupying authority is to seize control of the country's oil revenue and place it back into a dollar-denominated fund housed in the New York Federal Reserve. The pattern is difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. The question this timeline forces us to ask is not whether the euro switch was the only reason for the invasion, but why it was never part of the public conversation at all. If it was truly irrelevant, why was this direct challenge to American economic power and its subsequent reversal so completely omitted from the official story? This history remains highly relevant. Control over the dollar-based financial system gives the United States a powerful lever of influence over Iraq that continues to this day. In recent years, as Iraq tries to forge its own path, the United States has used its position to restrict Iraqi banks from dollar transactions, citing concerns about money laundering. These actions show that the financial plumbing established after 2003 remains a tool of American power, a legacy of a war whose true motives may be far more complex than we were ever told. The official story of the Iraq War is one of intelligence failures and a misguided search for weapons. But the documents and the timeline tell another story, a story about currency, oil, and the preservation of an economic empire. It suggests that while the world was looking for chemical weapons, a financial rebellion was being quietly quashed. This does not mean the weapons of mass destruction rationale was a deliberate lie for everyone involved. Many genuinely believed it, but it does strongly suggest that powerful economic motives, which were never debated in public, were at play. The euro switch is the missing piece of the public conversation, the documented fact that complicates the simple narrative we were given. The story of what happened in Iraq is not just about a war, but about the lengths to which a global power might go to protect its dominance. If this sequence of events made you uncomfortable, good. That's what the truth feels like. Subscribe if you want more of it.